or the last thing is just to piggyback on this idea of the M2 money supply is the if we're at an inflection point in inflation, um, because I think from what I'm saying, as far as what I'm expecting for Bitcoin, really flows into this idea that whatever inflation number we're at right now, where we are in bond yields, we're essentially at the bottom, and that we should be expecting now to for the 10-year and the 2-year to move up beyond 5%. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see 7, 8% on bond yields over the next 10 years, over the next 2 years. I'm not sure what to think about that because, or how those dynamics affect the market because for the longest time, I mean, we've been trained, or at least this is what I understood, that inflation bad and you can't get any number go up in an inflationary environment, um, like markets wise, in order to make money. But that seems to be not be true, right? Because you're getting this thing. What is it? 70% of consumer consumption is discretionary consumption is done by like 30% of the population. Like it's the
Pareto
wealthiest.
principle.
Yeah, exactly. Well, also that the wealthiest people in the population are actually the ones who are affecting the consumer goods market, and
Interesting.
so they're not really, inflation doesn't hurt them in the same way, so they're still doing their discretionary spending, right? If eggs for me cost 4 times more at the grocery store than someone else, that's not really affecting the bottom line of how many eggs are being sold. We're just, the average consumer is just poorer, but the actual money pouring in that gets affected, that the companies are making, that's not really being affected. We're not really seeing that. And so, and then with the higher inflation rate, or the higher percentage on bonds, well, then people with high net worth individuals can park their money and get 4%, 5%, and if we get up to 6, 7%, and then they don't have to take the volatility of the stock market. So then it's like, well, that could be bullish as well, because then they feel safer. They feel that they could spend more money because they now have this guaranteed 6%, 10% they're getting. They don't have to chase that same amount in the stock market. Then you add to that election years, they print money. So it's like, well, I don't see where inflation can stop. I think inflation has to now go up higher, and also at the same time, markets have to go up.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the most interesting surprises about consumer demand in general. You make an interesting point about how high net worth individuals may be contributing to some of that. I'm not aware of the stats in aggregate of the median incomes relative to the total demand of consumer behavior. It would be interesting to me to learn that 70% of that is coming from the top 30% of income earners. And if that's the case, then yeah, it seems like there's boundless room for continued demand on the economy. When at a time we need to obviously curb some of that spending in order to see prices come down. Um, the interesting thing is, like, one thing I don't think we've ever spoken about as a population in America is this idea that, like, maybe it's our duty as Americans, as citizens of any economy that's dealing with inflation, to tighten your belt, slow down, stop buying so much stuff, because that's actually a pretty simple thing to do, right? All you have to do is, like, curb your spending, and the less you demand of the market, and I mean the consumer market, the less we'll be dealing with inflation. We play a role in this every time we open up our wallet and make a purchase. And if collectively we've decided we have to help the problem of inflation, by doing our part from a civic duty perspective, we might see inflation get more under control. What's interesting is we've got economic bodies of and regulators in every country that feel it's their duty to control inflation by disincentivizing spending, by making the interest rates so high that you're less likely to spend. And of course, I know how that impacts, like, businesses' investments in capex, and cost of capital is much higher, so it disincentivizes businesses from expanding, and so on and so forth. But from a consumer perspective, we've got this ability to say, maybe I don't buy a new car this year. Maybe I don't buy a new refrigerator or some new appliances at home. Maybe I try to cut back on my dining out and so on and so forth. That will absolutely bring prices down if demand decreases. We can do that by conscious choice and not have to wait for our credit card interest rates to be 27% to slow down.
That's a very interesting way. I was not expecting you to say that. So the issue I have with that is that the spending is actually coming from fiscal policy, right? Fiscal policy in these governments, like for example, in Canada where I am, or even in the United States, the governments are spending so much money, putting so much money into the economy. It's sort of like um, when they used to tell us turn off your lights at home in order to conserve energy or fuel, but then billionaires are flying around on jets that'll consume more fuel than I'll ever consume in my entire lifetime. So it's like, well, how am I going to stop anything?
Yeah.
And then the idea is that do you imagine that high inflation is its own solution? That eventually, the higher the inflation gets to, the more then there will be this push towards deflationary effects because that's the other side of it. That's the other side of the sine curve.
No, I think that what we've been surprised by over the last several years, and I know Powell has mentioned that this specific point is that we've been surprised by consumer demand in general. Doesn't matter how expensive things get, people still just go and buy things. They still are willing to buy, a $27 cheeseburger at a restaurant. They're like, oh, well, I guess that's the price, instead of saying, no, I can't do this. This is too high. So we haven't quite found the limit where consumers will decide, okay, that's it. I'm not spending my money on this kind of thing anymore. And um, if that's part of the issue is that consumer demand is surprising, then I sort of reflect that choice back on ourselves. What choice can we make as citizens to think through the spending choices that we're making?
But the reason they want the consumer demand to go down is that they want that to then lead to unemployment.
So this gets tricky. I'm no economics expert here, but I think unemployment is one of those things that's supposed to have the effect on reduced spending. So, right, like ultimately the goal is to get people to stop buying things. If you stop buying things, prices will come down because merchants will have to reduce their prices in order to spur demand again, right? So, by creating unemployment, you're literally making it impossible for people to spend. If the goal is to not spend, then we as a society should stop spending.
Hmm. I would have to disagree on that.
So am I missing it? Yeah, help me out here.
The reason they want the spending to go down is they want to affect how um, businesses are behaving. That's what they want. And so because if the spending goes down, in order to be able to lower prices, the largest line item on for most companies is their labor. And so then what happens is that if when the spending gets down low enough for long enough, then the cost to hold on to that labor just becomes too much of a burden for the businesses, and then they have to fire people, and the firing of people that has effect on the economy. And so the thing is, as long as the balance sheet of the businesses are can handle the pain long enough, they resist firing people as long as possible because companies do not like firing their labor. And so that's what they're trying to break, because the consumer spending can ebb and flow just way faster than how the labor market moves. And so that's why the effect for lowering or raising interest rates is measured over 18 months and more, because that's how long it takes for the businesses to actually feel the pain, or the stimulus, in order to hire and fire people. And
Mm.
so they were talking about how now that the unemployment rate in the United States is up to 4% today. I think they were talking about something like at 4.1% is where, like, the threshold is where they now can start cutting rates. Like, okay, enough pain that's going on, been happening, because it is unemployment that they're looking at. That's what they really want. And so the idea that we would spend less, that makes it so that we're we're like agreeing, yes, we should spend less so that more of us lose our jobs. And that's where I feel like I push back on that, and what we really should be telling them is, hey, don't fiscally spend, right? Don't Government stop spending on these billions of dollars on all these different projects that are just money. They're not generating the productivity necessary, and get that money. Leave that purchasing power with the consumer, because the consumer then gets to vote with their dollars what they think is worthwhile, and then those things become more profitable, and the prices for those things go down, because that's what happens if the fiscal spend is not there, if the regulations and rules and monopolies and all that are not there around those that industry, the prices naturally come down for those products, because the businesses get better at making them more efficient and all that sort of thing.
Hmm. Well, that's a good consideration. I don't have a very strong stance on this one way or another. I just noticed that whenever we tend to um, deal with these inflationary issues, it usually becomes government policy in order to try to circumvent them. And I know that the pressure that they're trying to put on the economy is largely towards businesses and cost of capital and expansion there. But some of that pressure is obviously supposed to hit home as well. It's supposed to disincentivize you from um, wanting to take out another loan in order to buy something because the interest rate is just ridiculous.
All right, perfect. All right, so we'll leave it there. There's one other thing I wanted to mention. There's no way we're gonna have an answer to this, but I just love the idea of out there, and that is we've been using a lot of, and it's the reason I want to talk about inflation, the '70s and '80s as a analogy for our current inflationary cycle. But one thing they didn't have then is fourth turning. They weren't going through a
Yeah.
major fourth turning. They weren't going through a whole populist uprising in all kinds of different ways. They weren't. They had a demographic issue, not fourth turning style. And so I'm wondering how those dynamics of inflation will affect us now, because the higher prices are definitely causing people. Whereas inflation then in the '70s caused people to just change how they're going to buy homes, how they're going to do their jobs, and whatever. Now it's like, who's going to get elected? What are the policies that we want to we want to see enacted? What are the fundamental changes to the structures of our governance systems, of our institutions? It's a whole uprooting of things, and so I'm very excited how inflation meets with AI, meets with crypto, meets with this idea of the degens, the apes of together we are strong, that sort of idea, how that all mixes together into this perfect storm of changing everything for the next 150 years.
Hmm.
Should be interesting.
That's way too far out for me. So
Yeah, I
I
know.
can't do it.
I just wanted the keywords.